I never believed in Bigfoot until the day I found one lying dead in the forests of Olympic National Park. And what I discovered connected to that creature changed everything I thought I knew about the natural world, about the secrets hidden in America's wilderness, and about my place in it all. This is a story I've kept mostly secret for 3 years now, bound by non-disclosure agreements and government classifications. But it's a story that needs to be understood, even if it can never be fully told. My name is Marcus Webb, and I've been a professional hunter for 23 years, not the weekend warrior type who goes out with a group of friends to shoot a deer and drink beer around a campfire, swapping exaggerated stories about the one that got away. I'm the guy wildlife authorities call when there's a genuine problem, when there's a problem bear breaking into homes near private property, or when a cougar starts wandering too close to residential areas and someone's pets start disappearing, when a pack of coyotes becomes too bold, or when there's an injured animal that needs to be tracked and dealt with humanely. I track, I capture, I assess situations, and when absolutely necessary, I help resolve problems that pose real risks to people. It's work that takes years of experience in the field. An intimate understanding of animal behavior, a steady hand under pressure, and the ability to make difficult decisions quickly, but someone has to do it. And I've built a reputation as one of the best in the Pacific Northwest. It was mid-October 2023. Elk season had just begun in Washington state, and I had a special license to hunt in a remote area of Olympic National Park near the border with Olympic National Forest. The region was known throughout the hunting community for its dense forests of Douglas fir and western hemlock, trees so massive and ancient they'd been standing since before the Civil War, their trunks wider than a man's arm span, their canopy blocking out the sky. It was the kind of place you could walk for days without seeing another human being, where the wilderness was still truly wild, untamed, the way it had been for thousands of years before Europeans ever set foot on this continent. I parked my Ford F-250 on an old logging road that had been abandoned for at least 30 years, now completely overtaken by nature, covered in thick moss and ferns like a green carpet, slowly reclaiming what had always been hers. The road was barely visible anymore, just 2 faint depressions in the undergrowth where truck tires had once carved paths through the forest. I loaded my pack carefully with supplies for 3 days in the backcountry, my trusted 300 Winchester Magnum rifle, the same one I'd carried for 15 years and knew like an extension of my own arm, extra ammunition, 50 rounds, more than I'd need, but you don't take chances in the deep woods. A comprehensive first aid kit with trauma supplies, because the nearest hospital was hours away, even if I could get cell signal. My 4-season camping tent that had sheltered me through storms from Alaska to Arizona, a sleeping bag rated for 20 degrees Fahrenheit because October nights in the mountains could drop below freezing without warning, my life straw water filter for drinking straight from streams, 6 Mountain House dehydrated meals, lightweight and calorie dense, and my Garmin GPS unit, loaded with detailed topographical maps of the entire region, because while I trusted my navigation skills, technology provided an additional safety margin. I also carried my KABAR hunting knife with its 7-inch blade, sharp enough to shave, with my Petzl headlamp with spare batteries, and my walkie-talkie, though I knew from experience I wouldn't get any radio signal for most of the trip. The terrain was too rugged, too many ridges and valleys blocking line-of-sight communication. The plan was simple: follow a deer trail I'd scouted 2 weeks earlier, set up camp near a small creek called Whiskey Creek, and spend 2 days tracking mature bull elk. The area was known for some truly impressive bulls, with racks that could easily score high in the Boone and Crockett system. The hike to my campsite took about 4 hours. The trail climbed steadily through thick forest, crossing small streams and winding around huge fallen trees covered in bright green moss. The smell of the forest was overwhelming, a mix of damp earth, natural decay, and the sharp scent of pine. Every now and then I saw signs of wildlife. Fresh deer tracks, bear claw marks on tree trunks, a few blue grouse feathers scattered on the ground. When I finally reached Whiskey Creek around 3 in the afternoon, the sun was already starting to dip behind the mountains. I set up my camp in a small clearing about 50 yards from the creek, pitched my north-face tent, organized my gear, and started a fire with some dry twigs I'd found sheltered beneath a large hemlock. Dinner was simple, dehydrated beef stroganoff mixed with hot water. I sat back in my folding camping chair, planning the next day's hunt while watching the flames dance. Night fell fast in that forest. By 6 it was pitch black. I kept the fire going, more for company than warmth, and listened to the sounds of the night. Owls calling in the distance, the occasional snap of a branch, the steady murmur of the creek. It was peaceful in a way you just don't find near civilization. Around 9, I was ready to sleep. I stored all my food in a bear-proof canister and hung it about 100 yards from camp. Just as safety protocol demanded, I checked my rifle, made sure it was loaded but on safety, and set it beside me inside the tent. Then I crawled into my sleeping bag and switched off my headlamp. I must have been asleep for about 3 hours when I woke up to a smell. Not the normal scent of the forest. Something else, something deeply wrong. It was strong, foul, the unmistakable smell of decomposition, like something large had died and been rotting nearby for days. The stench was so powerful it made me nauseous even inside the tent. I turned on my headlamp and checked my watch. 2:47 in the morning. The fire had burned down to faint embers that barely lit the camp. I stayed inside the tent for a few minutes, listening carefully. No movement, no sounds of animals, nothing unusual except that smell. And it seemed to be getting stronger. My first thought was that a bear had dragged a carcass close to my campsite. That would be a serious problem. Bears guarding their kills are cautious but extremely dangerous, and the last thing I wanted was to be camping near one. I knew I had to check it out, had to find out what was causing that odor. I grabbed my rifle, switched off the safety, and stepped out of the tent. The night was cold, probably around 40 degrees, and I could see my breath hanging in the air. I swept my headlamp across the camp. The trees stood like dark walls around the clearing, their branches throwing shifting shadows in the light. The smell was coming from the west, away from the creek. I started walking slowly in that direction, rifle ready, finger off the trigger, but prepared. With every step the odor grew stronger, almost unbearable. I pulled a bandana from my pocket and tied it over my nose and mouth. It barely helped after about 200 yards through waist-high ferns that soaked. My pants with condensation and low pine branches that scraped at my jacket, I saw something large and dark, lying in a small depression between 2 massive old-growth trees. At first, in the limited cone of light from my headlamp, I thought it was a bear. The size matched. Maybe a large male black bear or even a grizzly, though grizzlies were rare this far west in Washington. But as I got closer, moving slowly with my rifle raised and my headlamp hit the form fully, I realized with a jolt of adrenaline that I was completely wrong. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before in 23 years of tracking through American wilderness. It was a body. A massive humanoid body, covered in dark, tangled hair, matted with dirt and decay. It was lying on its back in the ferns, long arms stretched out to the sides in an almost cruciform position. And even in the weak light of my headlamp, even through the obvious signs of rot and decomposition, I could clearly see what it was. My rational mind didn't want to accept it, but there was no denying what lay before me. It was a Bigfoot. A Sasquatch, a creature that according to mainstream science didn't exist and never had. I'd heard the stories all my life, growing up in Washington state, where tales of Sasquatch were woven into the very fabric of regional culture, as common as stories about salmon runs or Microsoft millionaires or the Seattle rain that never seemed to stop. Everyone knew someone who claimed they'd seen one. Loggers who swore they'd watched a massive ape-like figure watching them from the tree line. Hikers who'd found impossibly large footprints in mud beside mountain streams. Campers who'd heard wood knocks and howls in the night that didn't match any known animal. But I'd never believed, not once. I thought they were just legends born from misidentification, hoaxes perpetrated by attention seekers, or genuine mistakes where people saw bears at a distance and their minds filled in the rest. I'd seen plenty of bears standing on their hind legs over the years, and in poor lighting conditions, I could understand how someone might think they were seeing something more mysterious. But there it was in front of me, lifeless on the forest floor, as real and solid as the trees around it, as undeniable as the cold air I was breathing. I approached slowly, every muscle in my body tense, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The creature had to be at least 8.5 feet tall, maybe closer to 9 feet. It was hard to tell exactly with the body lying prone and bloated from decay, but even accounting for that, this thing was enormous, far larger than any human, larger even than the biggest gorillas I'd seen in zoos. Its hair was dark brown, almost black in many places, with patches of reddish-brown on the shoulders and upper arms. In other areas, the hair had fallen out in clumps, revealing thick, dark skin beneath that looked almost leathery, like it had been toughened by years of exposure to the elements. The skin tone was darker than I expected, a deep grayish-brown that reminded me more of elephant hide than anything primate. The face was the most shocking part, the feature that made this undeniably something other than a known ape species. It resembled a gorilla in some ways, yes, but the proportions were all wrong, the structure fundamentally different. The face was flatter, more human-like in its general configuration, with a heavy, pronounced brow ridge that cast shadows over the eye sockets even in death. The forehead sloped back, but not as dramatically as a gorilla's. The jaw was massive, powerfully built, jutting forward slightly, in what anatomists would call prognathism, but again not to the degree you'd see in other great apes. The eyes, now sunken and closed in death, were set deeper in the skull than a human's, but not quite as deep as a gorilla's. The nose was wide and flat, the nostrils large and flaring, clearly adapted for taking in large volumes of air. The mouth hung slightly open, and I could see inside to large teeth, an unsettling mixture of sharp, pointed canines, like a carnivore's, and broad, flat molars, like an herbivore's, suggesting an omnivorous diet similar to humans and other great apes. I circled the body slowly, keeping my distance, rifle still in hand, though I knew the creature was long dead, trying to catalogue every detail because I knew this moment was historic, that what I was seeing would change everything if it ever became public knowledge. The hands drew my attention next. They were enormous, easily twice the size of my own hands, which weren't small, almost the size of catcher's mitts. The fingers were long and thick, clearly capable of immense grip strength, with thick, dirty nails that looked like they hadn't been trimmed in years, because of course they hadn't. This was a wild creature. The palms showed thick calluses, evidence of a lifetime moving through rough terrain. The feet were equally massive, and far more interesting from a scientific standpoint. Each foot had to be at least 18 inches long, maybe 20, with a width that suggested incredible stability on uneven ground. The structure was fascinating, somewhere between human and ape. The big toe wasn't fully opposable like a chimp's or gorilla's, but it wasn't quite parallel like a human's either. It angled outward slightly, suggesting a foot adapted for both climbing and walking upright over long distances. The other toes were long and well articulated, clearly capable of gripping. The sole of the foot, where I could see it, showed heavy callousing consistent with a lifetime of walking barefoot over rocks, roots, and rough forest floor. Based on the state of decomposition, I estimated the creature had been there for at least a week, maybe 2. There were no obvious signs of trauma, no visible wounds, no marks suggesting a fight with another animal. But there was something strange about the abdomen. The area was more swollen than the rest of the body, distended in a way that didn't look natural. Even accounting for the bloating of decomposition, I knew I should call the authorities. Report this immediately. This would be the discovery of the century, definitive proof that Bigfoot existed. But it was 3 in the morning. I was miles from any cell signal, and my walkie-talkie definitely wouldn't reach anyone from here. And then, as I stood there staring at that impossible creature, my hunter's mind began to turn. What had happened to it? Why was it here alone? And what was causing that abnormal swelling in the abdomen? That's when I remembered something I'd seen in the local news about 3 weeks earlier. A story that had dominated headlines across the Pacific Northwest. For days, a woman had gone missing in the area. Sarah Mitchell, 28 years old, from Port Angeles, a small city on the Olympic Peninsula known as the gateway to Olympic National Park. According to the news reports, she was an experienced hiker and outdoor enthusiast who loved going out on solo trails, someone who knew the wilderness and respected it but wasn't afraid of it. She'd left for what was supposed to be a 3-day hike in Olympic National Park, following a route she'd done several times before, and she'd never come back. When she didn't show up for work on Monday, her employer had called the authorities. King County Search and Rescue had mobilized immediately, bringing in dozens of volunteers, search dogs, helicopters with thermal imaging cameras, the works they'd looked for her for a solid week, combing through hundreds of acres of wilderness, checking every trail, every campsite, every possible route she might have taken. They'd found nothing, not her backpack, not her tent, not a single piece of clothing. It was like she'd simply vanished into thin air, swallowed up by the forest without leaving a trace. Eventually, the search had been scaled back and then called off entirely, with the authorities saying they'd keep an eye out, but that they had no leads and no idea what had happened to her. A terrible thought crossed my mind, a thought so awful I didn't want to entertain it, didn't want to give it space in my consciousness. But I'm a professional hunter. I've field-dressed hundreds of animals over my career, from deer and elk to bears and mountain lions. I know anatomy, both animal and human. I know what different kinds of swelling mean, what natural decomposition looks like versus other causes of distension. And that swelling in the creature's abdomen, that unnatural bulging that extended beyond what decomposition gases alone would cause, it looked exactly like what happens when a large predator has consumed something substantial shortly before death, and the digestive process was interrupted. I took a deep breath, steeled myself for what I was about to do, and approached the body more closely. The smell was overwhelming this close, even through my bandana, a combination of decomposition, waste, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Using a fallen branch, I carefully probed the swollen abdomen, applying gentle pressure. The tissue gave way far too easily, the decomposition having done its terrible work over the past week or two, breaking down the internal structures. And then I saw something that made my stomach drop. Through the deteriorating flesh of the creature's belly, I could see a flash of color that didn't belong. Blue synthetic material, the kind used in modern technical hiking clothes designed to wick moisture and resist tearing. My heart sank. Like a stone, I knew what I would find, but I had to be absolutely sure. Lives might depend on what I discovered here, and I couldn't afford to be wrong. Using my K-bar knife, working as carefully and methodically as I could despite the overwhelming smell that was now making me gag, even through my bandana, and despite the horror of what I was doing, I made a careful incision in the abdominal cavity, extending the openings that decomposition had already created. My hands were steady, the result of years of practice field dressing game animals, but my mind was reeling. What I found inside confirmed my worst fear in the most horrible way possible. Inside the creature's stomach and intestinal tract were the partially digested remains of human tissue, fragmented pieces of bone that I recognized immediately as human in origin from their size and density, and multiple scraps of modern clothing. Blue nylon hiking pants, pieces of a red synthetic jacket, fragments of what looked like a nylon backpack strap with plastic buckles still attached. There was also what appeared to be pieces of a water bottle, the plastic partially dissolved by stomach acid, but still recognizable. And then, tangled in the mass of partially digested material, I found something that made my blood run absolutely cold. A driver's license, miraculously still partially intact, protected from complete dissolution by its plastic laminate covering. The photo was badly degraded, the laminate partially separated and the card damaged by digestive fluids, but the name was still legible, printed in that standard DMV font that every American knows. Sarah Mitchell, date of birth showing she just turned 28, an address in Port Angeles, an organ donor designation, and a photo that, despite the damage, clearly showed a young woman with dark hair and a bright smile, someone who'd had her whole life ahead of her. I stepped back from the body, my mind racing with implications, my hands shaking now, despite years of training and experience. This creature, this impossible creature that science said didn't exist, had killed and consumed Sarah Mitchell. The missing hiker that dozens of dedicated people had searched for, the daughter someone was grieving, the friend people were mourning, the employee whose desk sat empty at work. She hadn't gotten lost in the wilderness, like everyone assumed. She hadn't fallen into a ravine or succumbed to hypothermia or any of the other tragic but comprehensible fates that could befall a hiker in these unforgiving mountains. She'd been killed by something the authorities didn't even believe existed. Something that until this moment I myself hadn't believed was real. But as I stood there in the dark forest, 3 in the morning, surrounded by ancient trees and the smell of death, the initial shock began to give way to analysis. My hunter's mind, trained by decades of tracking and studying animal behavior, started piecing together what must have happened, and as the pieces came together, the picture that emerged was deeply troubling, but also made a horrible kind of sense. This didn't fit the pattern. Everything I'd ever read about Bigfoot sightings over the years, all the folklore that had been passed down through generations of loggers and hikers and Native American tribes, all the modern reports filed with organizations like the BFRO, they all described creatures that were shy, reclusive, almost pathologically afraid of humans. They avoided contact, they ran away, they hid. There were thousands of reported sightings over the decades, but almost no reports of aggression, no documented attacks, no patterns of predatory behavior toward humans. These were creatures that, according to all available evidence, wanted nothing to do with us and went to extraordinary lengths to avoid being seen. So why had this particular individual, attacked and killed Sarah Mitchell? What had driven it to do something that went against what appeared to be the core survival strategy of its entire species? I examined the creature more carefully, looking for clues. That's when I noticed the leg. The right leg had a wound, an old injury that had clearly happened weeks or even months before the creature's death. The leg was deformed, twisted in a way that suggested a bad break that had healed incorrectly. The creature would have been limping badly, possibly unable to hunt its normal prey effectively. And then I understood. This wasn't a natural predator attacking a human. This was a desperate, injured animal that had been unable to catch its usual food. Sarah Mitchell had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, crossing paths with a starving creature that had been driven by hunger to do something that went against every instinct of its species. It didn't make it any less tragic, but it made it comprehensible. Nature isn't cruel, it's indifferent, and this creature had been following the first rule of survival: eat or die. I spent the rest of that night sitting by my campfire, unable to sleep, trying to figure out what to do. By the time dawn broke at around 6:30, I'd made my decision. I had to report this. Sarah Mitchell's family deserved to know what happened to their daughter. The scientific community deserved to know that Bigfoot was real, and the authorities needed to understand what they were dealing with in these forests. I hiked back to my truck, drove until I got cell signal, and called the King County Sheriff's Department. They were skeptical at first. I didn't blame them, but I was insistent, and eventually they agreed to send someone out to meet me. What followed was a whirlwind. Within hours, the area was cordoned off. Federal authorities arrived. People I later learned were from the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the National Park Service, and even some agency I'd never heard of that seemed to be coordinating everything. The creature's body was removed under heavy security. I was interviewed multiple times, asked to sign non-disclosure agreements, told in no uncertain terms that I couldn't discuss what I'd found with anyone. They recovered Sarah Mitchell's remains from the creature's stomach and performed a full necropsy on the Bigfoot. DNA testing confirmed what we all already knew. This was an unknown primate species, something that didn't exist in any scientific record, a genuine cryptid that had just become very, very real. The official story given to Sarah Mitchell's family and the public was carefully crafted. They were told that her remains had been found and that evidence suggested she died in a wildlife encounter. They didn't specify what kind of wildlife. The family finally had closure, the certainty that she was gone, and were able to grieve properly and plan a memorial. The public statement was tightly controlled. The King County Sheriff's Department released a brief press note stating that personal belongings belonging to Sarah Mitchell were recovered in a remote area of Olympic National Park, and based on forensic evidence, they had determined that she perished in an unfortunate wildlife encounter. The investigation was closed. No mention of Bigfoot, no mention of the true circumstances. Officially, it was just another lost hiker tragedy, the kind that occasionally happens in the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. But within scientific and government circles, I knew it was causing massive ripples. The preliminary DNA results were revolutionary. The creature was definitively an unknown primate species with genetic divergence from known lineages dating back millions of years. 3 weeks after the discovery, I received an unexpected visit. A black SUV with tinted windows pulled into my driveway, and 2 men in suits stepped out. One introduced himself as Agent Morrison. The other was an older man he introduced simply as Dr. Stevens from the Department of the Interior. We sat in my living room, and Dr. Stevens explained why they'd come. "We've been tasked with determining whether there is a population of Sasquatch living within our national parks and forests, and if so, how to protect them while ensuring public safety. We need your help, your experience as a tracker, your knowledge of these forests, and frankly the fact that you've already encountered one of these beings make you invaluable. We're assembling a field research team, and we'd like you to be part of it." I looked between the 2 men. "You're offering me a job hunting Bigfoot." "Not hunting," Dr. Stevens corrected. "Studying, documenting, protecting. These creatures, if more exist, represent an invaluable biological heritage. They may also represent risks, especially if there are other injured or diseased individuals like the one you found. We need to understand their population, their movement patterns, their behavior, and we need to do it discreetly without causing public panic or attracting trophy hunters." I thought about it. I thought about that creature lying dead in the forest, a victim of both circumstance and nature. I thought about Sarah Mitchell and everyone who loved these wilderness areas. I thought about the fragile balance between humans and the wild. "I'll do it," I said, "but on one condition. Whatever we find, whatever Sasquatch we encounter, they're protected no matter what. They won't be hunted, captured for zoos, or exploited. They stay free in their forests." Dr. Stevens smiled. "That's exactly the attitude we need on this team. You have a deal." And so began a new chapter of my life. I spent the next several months working with scientists, conservationists, and law enforcement in one of the most unusual secret operations the US government has ever conducted. We set up trail cameras in remote areas, analyzed footprints and signs, collected and tested environmental DNA samples. And yes, we found evidence of more Sasquatch, not many. The estimates suggested perhaps 50 to 100 individuals scattered across the vast forests of the Pacific Northwest, a small, vulnerable population that had survived by keeping their distance from humans and living deep within the wildest corners of the wilderness. We implemented quiet protections. Certain areas were discreetly designated off-limits for development. Patrol patterns were adjusted to give the creatures more space. Illegal traps were removed more aggressively. As for the creature I found, the necropsy confirmed what we suspected. The leg wound had become infected, causing chronic pain, and severely limited mobility. Analysis of the stomach contents showed clear signs of malnutrition. The creature had been unable to hunt or forage effectively. There were also indications of systemic toxicity, likely from consuming processed human food. Its body couldn't metabolize properly. It was a perfect storm of factors that led to tragedy. A suffering, desperate creature making a decision that went against every instinct of its kind, and it cost both its life and Sarah Mitchell's. Today, 3 years later, I still do this work. I still spend weeks in the forests, tracking signs, monitoring populations, ensuring these magnificent beings can continue to exist without human interference. I've never seen another living Sasquatch. I've found footprints, signs of passage, heard distant sounds that might have been their calls, but they remain as elusive as they always have, ghosts of the forests that survived by avoiding us. And maybe that's for the best. Some things are meant to stay mysterious, to live in the shadows between the known and the unknown. My job isn't to drag these beings into the light, but to ensure the shadows where they live remain untouched and safe. The Mitchell family eventually reached out to me. It was a difficult conversation, but a necessary one. They thanked me for giving them closure, for not walking away when I could have. Sarah's father told me something I still carry with me. You gave our daughter back to us, not alive, but you gave us the truth. And truth, no matter how painful, is a gift. There are nights when I'm out in the woods sitting beside a campfire, when I think about that night in October, when I stumbled upon the impossible. I think about the choices I made, the lives that were changed, the secrets I now carry. The world will never know the full truth. People will keep debating whether Bigfoot is real, sharing blurry photos and shaky videos, telling campfire stories. And beneath all of that, a small group of us will continue working quietly to protect these creatures, to ensure they have a place in this rapidly shrinking world. Because in the end, that's what this is about. Not about proving they exist or satisfying human curiosity. It's about recognizing that this planet is still big enough, still wild enough to hold mysteries. And some mysteries are too precious to solve. They must be protected, preserved for future generations to marvel at. I never believed in Bigfoot, but then I found one and discovered something that changed my understanding of the world. I learned that the line between legend and reality is thinner than we think. I learned that our forests hold secrets we are only beginning to understand. And I learned that sometimes the greatest discoveries come with the greatest responsibilities. What happened in that remote forest in October 2023 was a tragedy on many levels, but it was also a revelation, a reminder that we share this planet with beings we barely comprehend, and that we have an obligation to be guardians, not conquerors, of the wild places that remain. That's my story. It's the truth of what happened, of what I discovered, and of the path my life took afterward. I may never be able to share it publicly. I may be bound by agreements and classifications, but I know what's real. And wherever those surviving Sasquatch are, deep in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, I hope they are safe, undisturbed, continuing their ancient mysterious lives far from human eyes. because some things are meant to stay wild.